Godzoners, YouTubers, people of Earth. How are y'all doing? It's been a while since I made a video, and there's been something on my mind for the past few days that I've been wanting to make a post on it. It's one of them things that it's one of those things that it's a sensitive subject, and no matter how you approach it, it's going to be troublesome um, from the get-go, and it's about the King James Version. I realize in my own study, in my own walks in life, how much of time is attributed to sorting out and understanding the King James Version Bible. And like I said, I wanted to do a post to try to open up some a dialogue. I'm kind of curious, and I'm kind of at a loss as well as to the matrix of the whole King James version, as in relation as to how it shapes our destinies, our souls. Because let's face it, most of us are studying King James version, and we're focusing on the word, the letter of the law, as in it's a letter. A lot of it is letters to churches and whatnot. And so I guess in in a nutshell, what I'm about to do is question the King James version. And right off the bat, I'm sure some of your heads are shaking. Not another one. But to me, I feel it's important to question everything that we think is of God. And I think we should look at everything with, at the very least, a great discerning eye. Because one thing we do know from the very version I'm talking about, as well as other versions, that the deception is going to be strong in these end times. And to me, what stronger deception can there be than give us a Bible that that would have all the tags and forks in the road that we can all be led astray. That being said, who is King James? The questions that come to my mind, which I'll put to your mind, is: did God, and you may know the answers, I'm not sure. If you do, feel free to post them on the board, and let's discuss them. But did God predetermine or predestine King James to do what he did elsewhere in the Bible, elsewhere in history? Did God somewhere say in the history of Israel that the King James was going to do what he did, as in compile all of the old writings, the old books in the Old Testament, and tell the story of the New, and compile them all together? Did God himself let us know through prophecy? Did he let us know through the prophets of old that these things were going to happen? Also, not to get on poor Paul anymore, but most of you already know my thoughts on Paul. I'm not against Paul by no means, and I think a lot of the stuff that Paul has wrote, if not 95% of it, is ordained and destined from God to be written and shared as it was. But also, I guess the whole Paul thing was primarily because he's wrote so much of the New Testament, and we get so much from Paul's teachings today in the Church of Christ that I guess those should be looked at and questioned as well, because they are pretty much what would be the word, contained together in the same writing. So King James, I'll start off by saying this is what I think happened. And first, again, I'd like to say I understand these thoughts bruise people's hearts and minds. So bear that in mind, and know that I'm not out to rip anybody. I'm just out to take a look at. I think what we should take a look at is King James like a is it the bomb? Is it the deal? Is it the true deal? Or are we kind of being fed a certain version that we're taking too seriously? Okay, this is what I think happened. I think God was telling a story through the lives of people, and I think that God had told these people to write these stories down. I think they did. I think the church, on up to the point where till Christ hit this earth, everything was up for grabs. There was no really mass writings. Everything was being copied by hand. It was a small number of people in Israel with the knowledge of God, and I think even when the numbers got large, and several times in the past, the numbers would drop down due to people backsliding and turning to a small g gods and so things. But Christ comes, and then the church is pretty much pissed. They don't want anything to do with Christ. They don't want to accept that He's King of Kings, Lord of Lords, because they like playing church. They like being the Lord themselves. I mean, they like people coming to them and offering up their children to them, and they like people coming to them and offering the finest of meats and offering all the finest of sacrifices to the churches. They like wearing the vested robes and all those things that goes in line with the church today as well as it did back then. They was not ready, and are they not ready today the same way to turn over the lordship of the church? So along comes Jesus. Long story short, they finally get Jesus on the cross. Now we all know that it's all in God's plan, but give the devil his due. That these things took place where Christ is stretched out on the cross. Christ, he's put to death on that cross, and in the church, the very same church that had to do with Christ being put up on that cross, they stay in shape. They stay in form. They're never really lost. You know, from the point that Christ was put on that cross, they never really lost power in the flesh. They never really went defunct. They stayed in power. Well, then a few hundred years later, along comes the Roman Catholic Church, and it's not beyond me that Roman Catholics and also the people who was in charge of putting Christ on that cross, in charge, not responsible, because we know it would be the Kenites that would be responsible for him being on that cross, but it was the charge of the Romans to actually follow that through and put him on there. So that same body of people, the descendants of that church, that same church system, who is now a few hundred years later, uh, 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 is now needing to teach Christianity because they see Christianity is not going to die. They see that the thing lives and it continues to grow. So now we got a church that it appears they need to gain some control over Christianity. So we got the King James team, and before that we have the popes and whatnot sending out these Knights Templars throughout the Holy Lands, which are supposedly on these crusades to win some battle. What in actual fact, what they're really doing is robbing the people of the Middle East and of those areas of their ancient scrolls, the ancient Word of God, and they're bringing these ancient scrolls and words of God to a unifying place in this under the church in the basement of the Roman Catholic Church where they are today, locked away, where nobody can read them but them unless you have express written permission from the Catholic Church to do so. So I mean, they got control of the old writings, and they killed a lot of people for those writings. I mean, we can see by history, if you take a second glance at our own even figures of our history, you find out that they weren't all gung-ho and as righteous as we were taught in our history school books. I think you can do the same thing with the Roman Catholic Church and the Knights Templars and those guys that were compiling that information. You can also question the motive of the church. Why did they want to get those writings out of the hands of, get this now, who God gave them to? I mean, those writings were given to those people in the Middle East and in charge by God and entrusted by God for them to keep that word holy and to keep it sacred and to keep it going. So what are we to believe? That King James was then given and trusted over those people who God originally gave that responsibility to? Was the white King James Version man somehow better suited to better suited to do that task? Uh, Curious. I'm not sure. I mean, we could look at it and say, well, maybe so. Maybe that's the reason. But to me, common sense tells me no. God left it with Israel, and He wanted those writings and those teachings to be in their care. But let's get past that. He takes them. He gets these holy writings. He compiles this King James book, and an odd thing again concerning Paul. He uses Paul's writings more so in the New Testament than he uses the writings of the 12 who was actually walking, witnessing, loving, living with Christ himself. Which, by the way, I think it's important to note that Christ handpicked these individuals. I mean, Christ went to these peoples in their daily activities, walked right up to them like he's known them for 1,000 years, and he worked the deal out where you're coming with me. Some of them were fishing, some of them were working, some of them were burying people. There's all these different things that these people were doing, and Christ said, hey, we got work to do. And they went. And they were charged with writing and witnessing and doing all the things that Paul seems to be doing more so in the King James Version book. I find that questionable. I find that not only questionable but answerable. I think there needs to be answers. I think we need to look at it in those terms. Because what I feel is, my fear is that we've all given ourselves too much faith in King James himself, and the team of King James, and the network of the church itself. Now, I know we're supposed to lend ourselves to a church, and we're supposed to be part of the church, and we're not supposed to be outside the church. But at the same note, I think it is noteworthy to realize that it was very much the church in the beginning as well as the end who are the center of conflict. And then, as in the beginning, you always got the church, the kings in the old days. I just got through reading the Kings and Samuel, and I was astonished, man, at the amount of times that these kings who were talking to God, and these kings that were being entrusted by God and given instruction by God, and lo and behold, man, one guy could die, and the son could take over the kingship, and hell, everything turns backwards, upside down, and they're worshiping Baal. And what's astonishing is how many times that happens, and it's like God's trying to tell us by the old history, is of our own history, how things are. That when God interacts with a generation and He proves Himself to be God, it's just that next generation that seems to forget everything and seems to go off on his own seeking a small g God. And my fear is that Roman Catholic Church a small g God? And is that Roman Catholic Church, the King James Version, the book, the Bible that we look to be the Word of God today, is that tainted by that small g God? I mean, are we reading a tainted thing? Is it questionable? And the first thing that most people come to me when I bring this up in conversation with them is, well, if you're not going to throw away the King James Version, what do you have? It'll be anarchy. And to that I say I have no intention of throwing away the King James Version. It's probably just as good a record of history as anything else. But that being said, is it 100% accurate? Can it be trusted as the Word of God all the way through it? I think that's what we need to ask ourselves. And we need to take a hard look at, sure, some parts we know. Anytime we're trying to prove our own theology, we can always point out and say, well, this is a mistranslation on this page, and it should actually be this instead of that page. Well, when you're trying to prove something you believe, it seems to be okay. But when somebody's trying to prove something opposite of what you believe, all of a sudden that word, that King James Version, becomes all infallible. It becomes concrete. It becomes unerasable, and you're not to fool with it. So that's interesting. Okay, I can see now this video is already going up to 15 minutes, so I'm going to let this in process. I'm going to continue this talk on. Again, I'm not bashing King James or Paul, but I do think it's important that they are questioned. I think, especially with God telling us that there's going to be strong delusion in these times, and when we look at the source where we get the majority of our teachings from, I think that would probably be a perfect place for strong delusion, if you think about it. So I think in order to be stronger than a serpent, we gotta get on the ball. Okay, people of Earth, I'm going to end this video and try to get it processed and put another one on right behind it. Okay.